How far to either side can I move without going on?
Just don't move too far.
Okay, don't move from here.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's also streaming live now.
That's fine, I know.
So we're very fortunate to have Mark Johnson join us today from Goldsmiths, and he's going to talk to us about researching players' lives and broadcasters and the methodological challenges that poses. So hand over to you, ultimately.
Fantastic, thank you, Tom. So in this talk I want to talk a little bit about kind of two things. Firstly about what aspects of esports I think are particularly worth our attention right now, and which parts can kind of feed most strongly back into esports practice. And also think about why in some ways it's quite tricky to research esports, and some of the challenges which Jamie and I have had over the last 2 years in trying to kind of capture esports data basically, and trying to kind of get players to talk to us basically, which proved strikingly challenging. And I will talk quite a bit about kind of why this is quite tricky, and some ways around it, and also in turn what this very kind of challenge shows us about how esports is structured. So basically I will first talk over why we look at esports as a scholar, and also how we research esports right now and how else we might research esports. And then I want to think a little bit about researching kind of how people get into esports, and how, as Jamie mentioned, how they sometimes fail to reach esports, and how that shapes their lives. Then also a kind of crucial point I think is that a lot of esports takes place in spaces which we can't necessarily see or can't access, and what this means both for research practice and for what kinds of things we should be spending our time researching. And also then I want to think a little bit about skill, in that clearly skill is quite central to esports practice, obviously, but it's quite hard to capture precisely what we mean by gaming skill, and who's more skilled and less skilled and why, and what kinds of metrics we use to try and study these kinds of things. And then finally I will look at kind of how you gain access to speaking with esports players and with kind of other actors within esports, and why this is quite tricky and how you can try to get around it. So firstly, clearly, why research esports? I'm sure we all know, but I mean, esports is big in terms of market, in terms of viewers. Although all those we heard prior, a lot of the figures being used are not necessarily completely neutral, and there's a lot more work to be done in terms of kind of the methodologies behind creating these kinds of figures. But also, I think in a kind of broader sense, and Jamie spoke about this a little bit, is that people who consume esports now tend to be those who are in the same demographic groups as those who are increasingly turning off from other older forms of media production. And also then finally, I think in terms of how esports is changing play to work, and also all these other factors which are entangled in some way in esports, which is worth trying to kind of unpick a little bit more, I think, is worth our attention. But then how do we use esports? That's slightly tougher for a bunch of reasons, which is that firstly, there's a huge volume of info out there. Most games take place online in kind of practice games and low-tier league games and things of this sort. But A, there's a huge volume, B, sometimes they are public, and C, even if they are public, it's not always easy to see how you can gain access to these kinds of games to view them. And then secondly, and I'll talk more on this in a minute, a lot of esports, I would argue, takes place behind closed doors in terms of agreements on contracts, in terms of agreements on teams, in terms of how people within a certain team speak with each other, and speak with their sponsors, and speak with their advertisers, and things of this sort. And so a lot takes place in these kinds of sites which aren't recorded or filmed or written down and so forth, and yet these are the kinds of things which I think in some way construct what esports is now. And clearly all of these aspects are less kind of striking than seeing 10,000 people in one room watching two people on stage playing games against each other, but they are also just as crucial to what esports is, I think. So I'd like to kind of argue that I think esports research up to this point has had a real focus on the kind of strangeness of esports in some sense. This idea that esports is deeply odd and deeply new and deeply groundbreaking and so forth, And whilst, yes, it is quite new and it is striking, of course, I think that the increasing kind of normalization of esports, I think the number of players and viewers and so forth, and the fact that for those who are truly involved within esports, this is not strange or weird or odd, it's just normal everyday life and it's normal everyday practice. I think these types of things show that we need to have a new kind of focus, not on the kind of high kind of level of what is esports and why do people watch it, but more on how is the kind of ecosystem built and what's it like to be part of that ecosystem. So firstly, we've been doing quite a bit of work into the kind of lives and the kind of career paths of esports players. And as we heard prior, there aren't really too many kind of formal paths into esports at this point. And a lot of people who we spoke with emphasise that even though right now the esports field is slightly more rigid and slightly more formal, it's still very fluid and there's still a lot of luck and chance is what a lot of people felt as well. And these kind of paths I think are useful to kind of look at in two ways. Firstly, because trying to make sense how someone goes from playing in their room to playing on a stage in front of 10,000 people tells us clearly a lot about esports' structure and also how much luck and skill there is in going from one to the next. But also because these paths, I think, will shape esports back, because these are the kinds of people who then become managers and trainers and so forth. And these are people who others look up to and seek to copy what they've done in order to reach the top. So their paths, I think, matter not just for them, but also because these paths kind of collectively shape both what esports is and what people who want to be in esports see, and thereby what they think they need to do if they want to succeed within this kind of space. Then also I think it's worth looking more at basically what it means to fail to become an esports player. And there's basically no data on this at all right now, but for every player who says, right, I will spend my whole life now trying to reach this top status, there's maybe twice as many who try and fail, or 5 or 500. We just have no clue what that figure is in terms of those who put in just as much work and just as many hours and so forth, but then fail to make it. And these people are clearly hard to see, because we only see those who make it, and then we think we can learn about what it takes to make it from purely viewing those, rather than also viewing those who didn't make it and trying to see not just what did they maybe do wrong, but what chances did those who made it had, which those who didn't make it didn't have. So these kind of unsuccessful players, in air quotes, are, I think, fairly kind of crucial part of the kind of broader esports ecosystem, and can teach us a lot about both esports itself and also how these players who put in a vast amount of work but failed to make it and are then, in a kind of work sense, worse off than if they hadn't tried in the first place, what their lives are like and how we can kind of help them and make esports a little less kind of either you make it or you're screwed kind of career path. So as well as lives and kind of career paths, I think it's also worth looking a bit more about on the path from bedroom to stage. What do people in fact do in this time? As we think of esports in some sense as being this very kind of striking kind of public face of huge stadiums, of huge games, of thousands of players, of thousands of viewers, of massive prize pools, of people making an income, etc., of kind of big and well-known players and how they are from social media and so forth. And clearly, yes, the kind of spectacle aspect of esports is clearly crucial to both A, why it's done so well in the last few years, and B, to the kind of thing that we should research. But that fact doesn't really tell us a lot about what goes on beyond the kind of public face, which one sees when one tunes on Twitch. So we found that a lot of esports takes place in places and in sites which we basically can't access, or it's extremely hard to access, or at best we can try to see the outcomes of those sites and then try and kind of read back and work out what took place within this site to make this thing happen. So I think, and this is not a kind of full list, but I think things like this show how much takes place off screen. So a lot of teams will create kind of tactics to use in really kind of crucial matches and then keep those secret until that match. and trying to make sense of the process by which they do that and the kind of strategic choice of when to use these things, I think is quite crucial. Also, as we heard about prior, the process by which teams change and players shift and so forth is fairly opaque at this point. Also, of course, if you have watched an esports broadcast, the teams talk with each other a ton, but we never hear that, and we have no clue what they say, and no clue how what they say shapes what goes on within the match itself. Fourthly, also, I think there's been a few kind of high-profile things in this, when it comes to players on one team who hate each other in some way or who really like each other in some way. But I think looking more closely at kind of what does it mean to be on a gaming team with a bunch of people who you probably didn't know prior, and how do those people all work with each other or don't, and how does that shape team play, I think is also crucial. And then also, as we heard prior, kind of contracts and how those are chosen and signed up to is also, again, fairly opaque at this point, and there's a huge range in terms of what kinds of contracts people get. And then also I think it's crucial to look at skill as well, which even though esports is the world's most skilled game players, skill has become this weirdly kind of, not quite overlooked, but it's being kind of defined within a certain way, I think, in most esports consumption and to a less extent in esports research, as this very kind of easily quantified thing. And I think the concept of a PM here is very problematic, really, because it reduces player skill to a single figure, basically. And clearly there are more skilled players with a lower APM and higher skilled players with a lower, so vice versa. But clearly there's a huge volume of what goes on when you try to play a game at a skilled level, which is not captured in how many things on the keyboard do you click. E.g., what kinds of choices do you make, how you talk with your teammates, how do you think through the game, and also I would argue that the skill of being able to negotiate the esports ecosystem is itself a skill, which is crucial to esports as well. So I think moving kind of beyond this and thinking through both what kinds of skills do players have, which are in some way kind of harder to see or harder to capture, and B, how does that then shape esports play, is also fairly crucial. And then finally on this front, I think it's worth also looking more at practices within esports which a lot of esports actors don't necessarily want to be within esports, but are still there, and we have to think about these in some way. And the two kind of crucial ones here, I think, are cheating and gambling. So in the first case, esports gambling, there's a lot of kind of figures thrown around here, but somewhere in the range of the one that seems most convincing to me, I think, is that somewhere in the range of $7 billion of virtual items was gambled on esports last year, which is a pretty astounding figure, given that this is basically a grey market trade in JPEGs for video games is a fairly interesting moment, I think. And this is clearly affecting a lot about how both on how esports is played and how fans consume it and how they see their kind of relationship to what takes place on screen. And then in terms of cheating, clearly we have doping, we have kind of programmed in cheating, and also match fixing, which is, and all of these things, I think, as esports gets bigger and as there's more money to be earned, each of these, I think, will become more crucial, and the incentive towards cheating and gambling will only grow. And so looking at both how these shape things now, but also what kind of regulatory systems are being made to try to counter these, I think is quite crucial. So then I'd like to talk now about researching esports. So clearly some esports research can be done online. You load up Twitch and you load up a stream and you watch the stream and you learn about the game and you learn about what the broadcasters say and how the crowd acts when things take place and so forth. And that's all good and that's all crucial, but especially these days we only get this very kind of polished and very kind of public-facing idea of what esports is from watching these kinds of streams. And this is only more the case, I think, as time goes by, when more and more actors want to make esports slick and smooth and family-friendly and so forth. So for instance, a game like Smash Bros. Melee had a wide kind of esportsy community for, say, 15 years prior to being more kind of formalized in an esports sense within the last few years, and the gap and the kind of evolution of their broadcasts shows us a lot about how, yes, you can learn a lot from this, but also B, the nature of the esports broadcast and the nature of what people think they are broadcasting when they broadcast esports is also changing, and so we need to somehow try to look behind these types of things. So even working with ESL and Twitch, our biggest kind of problem was just gaining access to players to talk to, because these people have a lot of people on Twitter and on Facebook and on YouTube and so forth, and they are extremely busy people. And also we found from those who we did get to talk to that a big part of the kind of esports job is basically marketing your kind of self in some way, in whether that's in terms of responding to folks on social media or trying to find sponsors or clearly just practice. A large part of what these people do is spending all their time extremely carefully and then extremely precisely, and we didn't really at the start have a clear answer to, okay, it's clear what they will value when talking to a fan, but talking to an academic, publishing a paper which will be a year and a half down the line, what precisely do they gain from this? How can we make them do what make them? How can we encourage them to speak with us rather than speaking with their fans? And that was quite a kind of tricky research question, especially because more so than, say, streaming, esports, we feel, has a stronger kind of image of what it is and is less, in some ways, keen to kind of to reflect a thing quite as critically as something like streaming, where what exactly streaming is still being formed in some sense, whereas what esports is far more solid, I think. So to resolve this, we tried meeting people in esports tournaments and so forth, but the issue here is that they are, of course, focused on playing and on practice, and if they think, well, there's £1 million here, I could practice, or I could talk to this person about a paper, it's pretty clear which choice they will make. So this also didn't work because there's just no incentive for them to spend their time on this kind of research. And so the point here, of course, is that esports is, I suppose it is when you move beyond the kind of macro level stuff, it's really hard to research because you have to basically get people to talk to in some sense when their time, and they've come to learn that their time is such a kind of precious thing that it should be spent on fans, on practice and so forth. And so what we instead did was to go to events where esports players attended purely to be visible rather than to play the games that they played. And this at last worked. So we went to a bunch of things like TwitchCon and like Con and so forth, where esports players turn up, but they aren't expected to play. They are either there to kind of meet and greet, or just to market a new hard drive or some new RAM or something. And in these kinds of cases, this worked extremely well, but we still had the kind of tricky problem of what does a single player gain from their time with us. But we found a kind of crucial part of this was the players like to talk a lot about their life experiences, especially in terms of a lot of players recognize that only, say, 1 in 1 million people who play their game get to where they are, and so trying to ask them to unpick what made them so successful turned out to be a really good angle, and something which I think also they were in some ways more kind of comfy with, having done that for say newspapers or for magazines or for websites and things of this sort. So our main kind of methodological finding here is that because, as we heard in the first two talks, esports is both such a competitive and such a time-consuming space, people within it have learned to manage their time in very particular, very kind of careful, very kind of deliberate ways, and trying to break into that requires one to reframe one's own kind of research practice, both in terms of where it's done and in terms of how it's done. So some final thoughts on this, which is that clearly esports is a fascinating thing to be researching right now, but broadly speaking, most papers and books on esports have tended to look at a kind of high kind of level macro view of esports is really new, really strange, and this is kind of how it plays out, roughly speaking. But we think looking at both the lives of players in terms of the kind of path they take from room to stage, but also in terms of what do they in fact do on that path, not purely in terms of just I practice the game and I get better, but what does that mean and what other kind of actors do they have to engage with in that process is also fairly crucial. And then finally, I'd like to argue esports poses a bunch of quite distinct, I think, methodological challenges which are created by the structure of esports and by how players therefore believe they need to act within the esports space, which makes it hard for the researcher to gain access. But I think a focus on these less kind of visible topics in some ways would be extremely good for both esports research per se, but also to academics being able to feed kind of meaningful stuff back to the esports sector. Thank you.
Cheers, Mark. Any questions for Mark?
So is there any academic research output from all the work that you have done, or is that visible, is that in progress, or what?
Excellent question. We have one paper out, we have 3 under review and a book under review, something like that. And a bunch of conference talks, of course. This was also something we found both with ESL and with Twitch, which is that their expectations for turnaround times are quite what ours were. So we'd say, so we'll write up a thing and then we'll get it published, and they say, so how long will this take, like 1 month, 2 months? Not quite what we had in mind. And so we'd say, well, if it's really quick, it might be a year. And so I think another kind of crucial part of feeding back to these people who we work with is finding kind of middle ground ways to do this type of stuff, whether it's presenting at conferences or kind of working papers or talking to newspapers or these types of things. I think being able to show something at the pace of the real world rather than the pace of the academic world, I think is quite crucial.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting issue, and I'm curious about whether there are things that we can do to try and build structures that allow the study of esports to keep up with the pace at which it's changing. And I think that's a practical analytical problem that is shared with many other issues, where the legacy journal publishing system is too slow to keep up with the objects that we're studying. And I think if we act as individuals, we get forced to adapt to that time horizon. And we need to think of collectively to anchor fields of study like this in new systems for disseminating work that still allow us to have careers. But that's not what I was going to ask, it's just I thought the last thing you said really interesting. What I was actually going to ask about your talk was about the kind of temporal horizons you're talking about and that kind of accounting for one's time. Both very prosaically, have you written about this yet and can I read it? And also, did you find
in terms of how it affects them, I mean, there were a lot of people who still felt that they had, say, 5 years left, that they were already planning on what they do at the end of that, and also a few people, both in streaming and in esports, who expressed to us that they planned to retire before they had to retire because it was so stressful, it was so high time and so forth, and loads of people, both from esports and from streaming, talked to us about how their personal lives had been damaged by their work, so they lost partners, they lost touch with parents, this type of stuff, and that was one of the biggest themes. I think that although they all stress that they love being in esports and being in streaming and so forth, and that they would trade for the world and all this type of stuff, they also stressed that, but it has also in some ways kind of wrecked my life as well, and yet no one seemed to regret that fact, but they did seem to acknowledge that and to now be taking steps to change that, even if they recognise that to some extent the damage has been done in some ways. So I think looking at that a little bit more and seeing the kind of gap between when you have to retire because you're too slow and other players are stronger and so forth, and people choosing actively to retire from the job that they've spent so much time and work breaking into, which 1 in 1 million people can do. I think the fact that people work so hard to break into such a tiny space, and then think, actually, this isn't that great, maybe I should leave, I think the kind of gap between those two things is something worth looking more on, I think.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant.
Chris?
Sorry, it's just a bit of a general question.
Sure.
Just a bit unclear, right? Like, how do esports players go? And like, who enforces it if there's like no proper central?
Excellent question. On the enforcement, the answer is it varies between games and between hosts and so forth. Some tournament hosts have drug testing now. I think the majority don't. I think it's still true at this point. Maybe like 1 in 5, 1 in 6 do, I would guess, something like that. The main method is drugs which are used for things like attention deficit disorder, like Ritalin, I think is the big one, isn't it? That's been implicated quite a bit because it's just like caffeine but more so, right? So that's been the big one, and there have been a bunch of cases where people have been caught using these sorts of things, but also a bunch of cases where people have been caught, but where fans have defended this, saying that this is fine, people should be allowed to do this and so forth, and also cases where, in some cases, players have kind of admitted it, but then argued that they need it because they have X, Y, or Z. So there's a very kind of, it's very much emerging at this point, but there's a kind of ecosystem of what counts as cheating, is this legit, should I be allowed to use this, how can I justify using this, etc. Plus, in most cases, it's just not tested for as well.
Yeah, and just to chip in there, there's a much broader context around what constitutes performance enhancement and what constitutes doping. I mean, a company called Nutribox have just sponsored Vainglory, for instance, and they develop a whole daily regime of what would be legal stimulants, basically around a healthy eating lifestyle, but supplemented by different times of taking caffeine at different times of the day and so forth. And that's a commercial entity that's sponsored an esports team, so there's a much broader context in which these kinds of conversations are taking place. Any other questions? I had a question for you, but now I've forgot it. That was it. So you're talking about access, and that a lot of it is mediated by third party in the sense that when we watch Dota 2 players, we watch League of Legends players, we're watching the screen. And I know some of this from my research, but it was actually the image you showed of the StarCraft player, and I was thinking, we don't tend to focus on actually the physicality that goes into the manifestations of the performance and the kind of methodological challenges that raises in terms of our understanding of skill. I wonder if you could.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I think on a kind of macro level, I think it's crucial to talk about the kind of challenges in research, because when one reads papers, one just tends never to really see these sorts of things. And so I think it's important to look at, especially for something new and exciting, which lots of people want to research. I think it is worth kind of asking ourselves, okay, but what does it truly mean to research this thing? And when we do research, are we in fact catching it all, or do we only see a kind of small part? In terms of the physicality of skill, I think, depending on how one looks at this, I mean, a large part of esports takes place between the player and the keyboard and the game, of course. But that we tend not to really see, and I think one aspect which makes it tricky, of course, is that to use traditional sports as the kind of point of comparison, is that clearly watching the player and watching the game are the same thing in those. Whereas here, watching the player, you just see a person doing that, and watching the game is elsewhere. So that, I think, on a kind of very, very kind of basic level, I think just that split between the player's actions and the play of the game, the fact that those are not tethered, and you have to be very skilled to look at someone doing that and look at the game and see the kind of causal chain there. I think that's very difficult in esports versus tennis or football or something. And so I think trying to make more sense of that, I think, is quite crucial. And also, but also, like I say, I think so much of this is not, it's enacted by what you do physically, but it's also to do with speaking with your teammates and to planning tactics and theory crafting and so forth. And all of those things all kind of feed into the kind of final second of this is the big event, the big thing, I bring it all in here and use it. I think the physical skill of esports is not just how fast can I move, but it's also how fast can I think, how fast can I chat with my teammates and so forth. There was a good thing I read somewhere about why there's fairly few truly international teams because of the language issue, and you have to be able to speak quickly. So if you don't all share the same tongue, then you can't do that.
That's very interesting. Any other questions?
I've just got a question. Has there been any interest in this research from the esports industry?
More so from the streaming than from the esports sector. Some from the esports, definitely. It's been mixed. I think, like I say, I think a part of it is that the esports sector is very clear on what its product is, I think, at this point. And it's possibly looking less than streaming at kind of external concepts and external ideas here. But also, I think a large part of it is that the particular direction that some parts of the esports sector are going in now is much more like things like creating programs which can track crucial parts of games and enable the camera to always zoom in on the best part. Something like that, which is very technically focused rather than socially focused. That type of stuff gets, to an extent, I think, more attention in some ways. So that's definitely affecting some things too. But we have been working with ESL and Twitch on this, and hopefully that will go on. But it's been, yeah, mixed bag, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you very
Right,
much.
thanks, everyone.
Josh, would you mind going next?
Yes, I can. It's mine.
Yeah, I'll just put it in there.
It's a PowerPoint presentation, so we can
I'll just put it in there. In my experience, external partners are interested in, they're still asking questions about STEM and, you know, this idea, can the skills learned within video games translate into other areas of life, rather than the focus being on appreciating the performance for what it is. I mean, and so there's a lot of...
Is that, do you mean other education?
They're interested in the psychology of, you know, the educational
right,
qualities of learning to be able to manipulate quickly,
right.
rather than just looking at it. You know, no one's going to David Beckham and saying, well, what's football doing for STEM skills?
Right.
I mean, that's, in my experience, what some companies have been interested in. And I think that there's, you know, broader questions there about seeing video games still as an escape, not as a, you know, a thing legitimate in and of itself. Josh. Yes. Okay. So just left and right on the.
Yeah, that's right. Cool.
Okay. Okay, everybody. So next up we have Josh Jang from UE, who's going to talk to us about esports ecologies and through the case of League of Legends. Okay, and over to you, Josh.
Hey everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a PhD candidate at UE, just coming to the end of my research really, and I'm going to kind of present some certain aspects of it today and try and delve into what I mean by ecology in the context of League of Legends. So. This term ecology, like, straight away, you know, what you're probably thinking, what do I mean by it? And we've all used the term probably today already, ecology, like esports ecology. Yeah, right. Yeah, but I mean, everybody does. Like Riot Games, who make League of Legends, use this term all the time. They often talk about the health of the ecology. If they make a decision, a game design decision or something, you know, to user-generated content, they'll say it's for the health of the ecosystem. And it's often taken at face value, and it's kind of like, okay. Yeah, but it's actually, you know, it's an important term because it also has a background in academia as well. And I won't talk too much about sort of academic frameworks and stuff which talk about the term ecology, but there's kind of media ecology, connective ecology, active network theory, which also relates. But it's kind of a way of describing, if you like, a an intricate system of relations and how different actors might relate to one another, how different motivations come together. To think about, you know, what it is that makes up the site of anything really, but how it relates to its wider ecology. But to get critical with that term, and people often criticise some of these academic frameworks for this same reason, but in describing an ecology, it can be great for describing the intricate relations and the kind of broad picture of what's going on, but what's often missed is the power struggles, the power dynamics that are going on in ecologies, and this criticism is sometimes labelled actor network theory, media ecology type approaches. But it could also be labelled at the same kind of more widespread use that we're probably all using it in, that Riot Games often use it in when they talk about the health of their ecology. So that's what I really want to delve into today, you know, how problematic is that term, and what do I mean by it? Because right, in any ecology, something's always being eaten, right? So that's where I'm kind of getting with it. So just to kind of elaborate on a couple of those points, some of this is just what I said, but one thing that will keep coming up today in this talk I'm doing is developers as well. And we're talking about Riot Games and League of Legends specifically, because, you know, talking about ecology is such a wide thing. But what do I mean by developers as well? Because the role of developers has shifted very, very rapidly in the past few years with the onset of esports games and these games which are kind of monetized over long periods of time and sustained and keep people coming back to them. And what we're seeing now is with developers like Riot Games, you know, who are also a publisher and also kind of rule their whole ecosystem of user-generated content, of the professional players, of certain esports industries in different parts of the world. They're not just a game designer, right? They're not just doing game design anymore. They're actually having a real impact, a real big tangible impact on people's lives, people's professional lives, but also big, you know, growing, very influential cultures. So I want to sort of problematize the notion of developer a bit as well alongside ecology. From this, I mean, the main point, the main crux of what I'm talking about today is the political economy of what's going on, and to try and think about, you know, the power dynamics that are inherent in the ecology of League of Legends. But you're probably thinking, if you don't know League of Legends, what the heck is encompassed by the ecology of League of Legends? Well, I should have probably said that the map in the background there is the League of Legends map. This is basically what everybody who plays League of Legends plays. That's the map they know. This is the thing that's kind of gets about as much scrutiny as a chessboard or something like that. But it's one of the most popular games in the world, and it's kind of its ecology, if you like, includes the game. It includes, and Riot Games often talk about the ecology of their game, so they'll talk about the way different champions or different items or different facets of the map relate to one another. So if you like, the game is itself an ecology, but they also use the term to talk about that wider setting we probably all use today, you know, the esports ecology. That is the Twitches of the world, the professional players that, you know, play on Twitch, the YouTubes, the actual esports organisations like the Fanatics, the TSMs, you know, the SKTs, that's the South Korean Telecom. So there's all of this which is included in the ecology of League of Legends, but it all comes together and all, and the developer, if you like, caught in the midst of all this, trying to do their job of game design or trying to control this ecology in certain ways, it is often torn between different motivations and different stakeholders that they're trying to serve. But what's really noteworthy about League of Legends, and League of Legends was released in 2009, which seems a bit crazy to me because time's flying by, but I mean, that's what, 8 years now, and since maybe 2011, 2012, when it really exploded in popularity, when this kind of esports, its whole esports scene really grew. It's got a lot of money every year, a lot of money in revenue. And the key to understanding this is it's free-to-play model. But they call it a fair free-to-play model. But it's a really powerful and influential way that they've come to monetize this whole kind of ecology that's grown around their games. I've got to put here, you know, League of Legends generated $1.8 billion last year. But it's been doing this for quite a few years now. It's been one of the most popular games in the world. It's making staggering sums of money every year. That's Riot Games through selling this stuff, skins. And this is what they sell in their game. They sell kind of purely aesthetic things. They mentioned that they have a fair free-to-play model. What I mean by that is that they allow anybody to download the game for free and you can play. And the idea is that different games have slightly different variations of this. But the idea is that anybody can play competitively. There's no competitive advantage given to any player for paying money, which before 2009 League of Legends was doing this, a lot of free-to-play games were kind of what people call pay-to-win, and their lifespan was typically quite short because the whole sort of ecology, if you like, of the game just kind of broke down quite quickly as people spent lots and lots of money and became very powerful and put off everybody else, and eventually they left as well. But that's not what happens in League of Legends. Because they've just selling aesthetic things, they've created a game which has a real sustainability and sticking power and real competitive appeal. And I think actually, this is a big reason why it's become such a popular esport as well, because it does cross over with traditional sports. And this morning we were talking about, traditional like football and stuff. Anybody can get a ball and go kick it, and you don't have to download a game to do that. I think in the free-to-play model, the fair free-to-play model, where anybody can download it and play competitively, I think that bridge has crossed somewhat. I think they've managed to sort of hybridize that distinction somewhat, where anybody can, in theory, just play the game and get it for free. Obviously, there's the hardware, which is always an issue, but I think that they've hybridized that in some ways. But why I'm talking about this whole free-to-play model is because it's absolutely how they have come to monetize their ecology. And I've done a lot of sort of ethnographic work, talking to players, doing open discussions with players about why they spend money on League of Legends. Sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes more than thousands. I'm talking $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, pounds, whatever. People have spent in this game over quite a few years now. And I always pose the question to them of why. And it's not just what often comes out. It's not just the use value of the skin, the aesthetic thing, which they're paying for. It's almost a reciprocal relationship here that's going on between developer and player. Players often talk about Riot Games. I was about to say affectionately. It's not quite affectionately, but they're sort of they've got this hybrid, kind of very effective reputation among their player base, where they're not seen as a traditional developer, right? They're doing things their own way. They're supporting their esports ecology in ways that developers haven't done before. They're talking to players in ways that players haven't done before. They're giving salaries to players in their leagues, which hasn't been done before. And you could say, okay, so those players are now what Riot employees, right? They're employees for Riot Games. Well, they're not really, because they kind of blur the line. And we talked about the relationship between the top down and the bottom up this morning. I think professional players very much kind of walk that line between, especially when they're talking to their viewers on streams, or they're really garnering their bottom up fan bases, which they've made themselves. But at the same time, they might be paid by Riot Games with a salary. Those lines become really foggy, and that's the key to monetizing this game for League of Legends, because they've garnered this really hybrid identity. And I put down here some sort of academic frameworks, thinking about gift economies, which I won't talk about to any great extent. But what's often talked about in talking about any gift economy, and a gift economy is basically where people give gifts to one another and expect it to be reciprocated, and there's not necessarily any money involved. It's a gift, and if you like, the game here is a gift to players, and the money is reciprocated in one way or another by players. But what's often talked about in those kind of notions of gift economies is that it's a total social phenomenon. The way people exchange with one another is always mirrored in certain ways by the totality of their sociality, and that's what you see in this game with its ecology, with its wide spanning system of esports. So, to go back to the relationship between bottom up and top down, which is a big theme here. This, if anybody knows League of Legends, this is a very famous game, very famous play. I don't know how clear it is to people that can see, but this is Expeke. He's a famous Spanish player for a team called Fnatic, and this was a game in early 2013. And what basically happened here is the opposing team, which was SK Gaming, were going in for the win. It was really exciting. I think it was an ESL, in Katowice. ESL or Intel Street? Yeah. Anyway, but they were going in. It was very, very exciting. And then Expeke basically pulled out a move nobody had seen before. He snuck round the enemy into their base and destroyed their HQ by basically dodging all the things that they could do to him, which hadn't been seen before. And it's a move which came to be known as the Expeke. Like, players now know it as the Expeke. Every professional player that's done it since and it has been done a few times since on professional stages. It's like the move the explicate, and many different esporting games have examples of players that really stamp their authority on the game and said, that move is now mine, or that it could be the cane combo in Smash Brothers or something. But League of Legends is again absolutely rife in it. It's got these bottom-up moments, these moments that players have stamped their authority on, and I think that's again key to what's at stake for Riot Games, because they're monetizing this, right? They're getting people to pay billions, literally billions every year for aesthetics in the game because of what is quite a hybrid identity between kind of top down and bottom up. And I don't need probably to talk about this to any extent, but it's obviously a very influential model. League of Legends is one of the biggest games in the world, and definitely one of the most pioneering in terms of esports, which we probably all know about. So that is what I mean by ecology, and that is what I mean to say by developers which are kind of monetizing this and have kind of found ways to monetize it. Because I said League of Legends was released in 2009, Dota 2 was released a couple of years later, Heroes of the Storm, another MOBA. They all copied this free-to-play model because it's so successful. Because giving games for free to people is seemingly the way to do it in esports, or at least continuously monetizing it anyway. But there are moments of discontent, and the title of this talk is Esports, Ecologies and Their Discontents. I'm really interested in the moments of discontent, the moments when this whole kind of gift economy and the ecology has cracks, when there are moments that it doesn't work for everybody, and there's a bunch of examples here. The slide is called Rito Please, which is a meme that's very popular in the League of Legends community. Rito is like Riot Games, spelt wrong, I don't know why it is, and Please, but also spelt wrong. There's basically a moment where things break down, where Riot Games do something dubious. There might be an LCS ruling, outlawing a team, or it might be a balance change, which is to destroy people's expertise, or it might be, not giving practice mode to pro players because they want to keep it as widely appealing as possible. There are a lot of moments where people kind of shout out this meme, Rito please, but they're serious moments of discontent in the ecology of what I'm talking about. And one that I'm just going to elaborate in particular on today is the balance and content updates. Now, League of Legends and similar MOBA games, they're updated every week or two. And often these changes are iterative. They iterate things out of the game and they iterate things into the game. But it's Riot Games, if you like, trying to keep it fresh, trying to keep the wheel turning, trying to keep the bottom-up innovation keep coming up. Because it makes sense to them, right? This is how they make money. But from a professional player's perspective, it's very, very problematic. And this is a really long quote, I probably won't read it all, but then I started putting it on the slide. I was like, this is too good not to include. But this is TSM Reginald in the bottom right here, and this is Skara. They're both ex-players, both quite influential, well-known ex-players in League of Legends. Reginald here founded Team Solo Mid, which has many different teams in many different leagues, different players, and they're one of the most successful League of Legends teams. So he's a really, really influential figure in League of Legends, and if you like, he might even be the top down now. He was very much, go back 8 years ago, he was the guy streaming to people with small followings. But now he's a very influential figure in esports. And what he said, I think this was in last year, was that all these constant patches, they're putting tremendous strains on professional players. And this is, as I mentioned, TSM Reginald, this is one of the most successful people to come out of League of Legends. And his players that play under him in TSM, that's one of the biggest teams, so they're really successful. So if he's saying that it's putting tremendous strains on players because the game is constantly changing, it's constantly forcing people to adapt, it's constantly essentially destroying their expertise. It's a meaningful thing because this is somebody in a relative position of power in the overall ecosystem. So I mean, the precariousness for other players is a lot more severe. But what I really liked about this quote, and I think the words have jumbled a bit over there, but he compares it to this. He says, if this were like the NBA, the basketball league, it would be like changing the basketball into a bowling ball the night before the playoffs. And that's what Riot Games do. They constantly change it. And there was a big controversy around this when it happened. Lots of different people lent their voices to it. the CEO and founder of Riot Games, somebody called Mark Mill, kind of offered his perspective to try and defend it. But players often saw this as, this comment here puts it, which was another comment from a discussion on Reddit, you know, what Riot Games are trying to do here is they're trying to keep it fresh, they're trying to monetize us, they're basically trying to turn the games into an all-out action thing which everybody can laugh at, and there's all different kinds of variations that are going on. It's very, very exciting. But for professional players, like, you're destroying their expertise, and that's what Reginald was saying in that last slide. He's saying, you know, that my players spend 10, 12 hours practicing every day. They spend longer, or even longer, you know, devoting their entire life, as long as they can, in esports to this. It's not really right, is it, that we're changing it to this extent? So this is one moment where Riot Games are really trying to serve their role as a developer. They're trying to game design their game in a way that's going to monetize it, because it's keeping it exciting, keeping it fresh, keeping it bottom up. But for players, you know, it's not right. And from Reginald in that interview, if you're interested, I'd recommend checking it out. I'll send you a link or whatever. But he talks about you know, the precariousness of it all. He talks about, let's go back 1 second. Yeah, he talks about it being a major reason why these players are burning out by age of 20, 21. And League of Legends perhaps more so than any game. If you get to the age of 21 or something, it's like you're 40, you know, it's like that's it, your career seems to be done. And there are exceptions, there are obviously kind of exceptions, but many players burn out by then. A big reason for this, you know, this hugely influential person is saying is burnout. It's because the game's changing too much. It's because Riot Games are trying to serve too many people, or trying to serve themselves really, but not really taking account of the professional players. And this is another example. I've got a few examples. It's just a case of how much time I have to talk about them. Have I been about? Well, I don't know how long I've been. But I'll quickly talk about some.
You've got a couple of minutes.
Some minutes, great. So this was another example. I think, you know, a big moment of discontent in ecology where Riot Games stepped in to do something on behalf of someone, and then people found out. And yeah, basically what happened here is on Twitch TV, somebody created sort of a bot, a spectate function, over one player, one very, very famous, probably the most famous League of Legends player ever, named Faker, who's a South Korean player. He's kind of like the Messi or the Serena Williams of League of Legends, if you like. Very, very famous. But what this bot did is it followed him in every game and streamed it, and people were loving it because he doesn't stream all of his games. He doesn't, and people can't talk about it in Twitch in real time to each other. So it's a really appealing thing. But then again, this Mark Merrill figure, this CEO of Riot Games, stepped in and said, no, this is illegal, we can't do this, and he called it e-stalking, which is a weird term, which got all kinds of strange things. But then what happened in the next day or two is the spectate Faker stream came back up, and the person said, no, this isn't illegal, you've got a spectate function in your game, there's bots you can use to do this. Anybody could go watch Faker. What we're doing here is we're enjoying watching you on Twitch with each other, you know, in the Twitch box with each other. Yeah, but Mark Merrill continued to defend the position. It turned out Mark Merrill had ties to Azubu. Now Azubu are a South Korean streaming platform in themselves, and they've got the rights to Faker. They're the ones that control his rights. So they were saying, oh, anything that goes through Faker should go through us, not Twitch. And this Twitch stream, I should have mentioned, was a non-profit, and nobody was making profit off. I think there was a donate function, which was all given to charity, just in case people felt like it. But it was a moment where, again, the motivations of Riot Games became clear to everyone, and they was like, oh, hang on, they're not this great hybridized, you know, we're all gamers and enjoying it, and hey, let's spend money on things. It was a big moment of discontent where the different motivations became clear. I think eventually Faker has switched over to Twitch now, because Twitch is so much bigger in the West that people can watch it there. Again, it was another important one. And then there's obviously their leagues themselves. And I haven't talked too much about the league structure of League of Legends today, and I won't in any extent here, but they basically run the League of Legends Championship Series, the LCS, which is their own sort of governed league that is in Europe and North America, and they have obviously a big influence over the South Korean league, the Chinese league, Brazilian league, all these places. But these two they control quite tightly, and which means they're kind of judge and jury for everything that goes on. If a player says something very dubious, they're the ones that dish out the punishment. Or if a team's owner does something dubious, maybe with a trade contract or a player, trying to attract a player to their team, they're the ones that step in and say no. And they might even ban the owners in some cases. It happened with a team called Team Renegades. It was very controversial. But it's problematic, right? Because they're ultimately going to be serving themselves here. There's no regulation as of yet. There's no independent bodies. There's nothing really to control this or come in and say, hang on a minute, that you're not serving the health of the ecosystem, as they always like to say. It might be their own motivations. It might be their own ties, and there's lots of ambiguities that go on there. At the moment, for example, they're currently in the process of transforming the North American LCS League into a franchise league, which has huge implications for owners and players and everybody, because especially for owners, because if it's franchise, it means you can't get relegated. A more sustainable investment, as we talked about earlier today. But for the ones that don't get in, that league, it's like, well, yeah, that's it. And so there's all kinds of questions going on about who should get in, who should not. The European teams have applied to get in because it's a safer investment. And it's down to Riot Games ultimately to decide all this, which is dubious. And this is a meme. This is, as I said, this is Mark Merrill. This was on April the 1st this year. This is the co-founder and CEO of Riot Games. But again, it's like he's just become a meme now because he always defends. He's the one, and I'm not picking him out or anything, but he's the one that has to straddle that kind of line between, okay, I'm Riot Games and the developer, but I'm also controlling this widely spanning ecosystem. So it's become this big sort of meme, if you like, in the community. And Riot Games have embraced this. So just as a final thought, really, in thinking about the contradictions here in trying to run an ecosystem that Riot Games have constantly come into, constantly try to serve themselves, serve the continuity of their game, but also that there is no independent bodies, right? And things probably should change quite soon. There probably should be independent bodies that control these aspects of the esports ecosystem that actually maybe are more legitimately concerned with the health of the ecosystem, that is the lower parts of the ecosystem as well. That's
thank you
some
very
of my
much.
research.
Okay, questions for
I've just got an observation really.
Right.
These Riot Games patches burning out professional players don't buy it for one second, quite frankly.
I think it's
There's
more
101 other reasons why people burn out. You'd expect professional players to be able to adapt more quickly than unprofessional players to changes in the ecosystem, as you call it. I think they're whinging because they train too hard in the first place and they're pushing themselves and they shouldn't be doing that. It's unhealthy. But I think it's their vested interest. They're complaining that the game is changing when in fact they're the best players. It's changing for everyone, so it affects everyone equally, and it's their vested interest about them having, because they've committed so much time to it in the first place, that they're going to have to commit even more time to get back to the same level. That's no different from everywhere else. I don't buy the fact that Riot Games patches actually contributes to burnout.
I actually disagree with you and agree with the sentiment that I think in esports in particular you become so accustomed to playing the same kind of strategies and the same versions of games, and even tiny adaptations can throw teams off, and it's particularly difficult in esports to sometimes restructure and coordinate to adapt to these changes, and that can be on a number of things. Training sessions, time zone differences between the teams is a big issue that we encountered, and the feedback that we see all the time. I mean, as Paul mentioned before, we work with companies like Gfinity who do hold these either elite or challenger series with games like CS:GO, and every time there's a change in the game itself, it completely throws off the team structure. So I agree in the sense that it affects everyone, but I'd say that for a professional team, even a difference on the map or a new rule or downtime, etc., causes detrimental to issues to people's play.
Absolutely, I'm not disagreeing with that. It's the burnout phrase is the bit I guess.
It was a phrase that was used by the regiment figure there.
I think that's vested interest. I mean, I don't. I accept that any changes to any rules will affect you, and you'll be pissed with it. But that's not
it
what I'm
affects
saying.
people unequally, though. If your particular skill at the game is invested in one champion, one set of champions, one role, and then that role is drastically changed, or the whole way of playing for that particular person has changed, it's different for the other 4 players that might be on the
But
team.
ultimately, I think it's a question of power, isn't it? And I think that in the context of a company who owns the proprietary technology to decide whether or not they want to cut by 10 or 15% the ability of a certain hero, that is way more power than FIFA has over the entire, the rules of football.
Yeah.
So I think that's really where the conversation lies. Jamie.
Yeah, first off, I just want to say it sounds like a really impressive project.
Oh,
So I'm looking forward to seeing
It'll come out in some big forms.
Yeah,
sometime soon.
that would be great. I was reminded, and maybe I've imagined this, but maybe I haven't, that there was a discussion with some of the Riot developers about the tension of updating the game, and a lot of it was around, I think, randomness. And so they were saying for regular players, it's nice to have an element of randomness. To have some point in which the game isn't entirely about skill. Whereas for pros, that's obviously, you don't want any element of randomness. You want it to all come down to training, skill, and so on. And it seemed to me to be an interesting example of how you build a game big enough and enjoyable enough for enough people who can play it and take part in it, that it can support a pro team. But then how you make it precise enough. I guess those different tensions that are coming in, and I think that's...
Yeah, I'd be interested to know where you read that about the random, because early on, Riot's whole ethos of game design actually was to try and stand against random. I think they said there should be sort of no barriers to like there should be nothing that stops a player being able to play based on their knowledge of the game solely. They wanted it to be sort of pure sort of skill and try and intensely balance. That's how they put forward their balance design. And they did things in the game like try to take out dodge, for example, for champions. So if you by chance dodge a skill, which is something you can add in through runes through starting in the game, that's something that can drastically change a game. So they took that out, and they've done things, for example, with crit ratios. A crit is a critical hit, which has a chance percent to do a lot more damage. They've kind of tried to make that so it happens more regularly, so you can account for how it's going to happen. So they've typically tried to take some of those elements out in ways that other games, like Dota, for example, hasn't done as much because it's been a bit more true to the mod, which had a whole different game design ethos. I'd be really interested to read that.
I'll dig it out.
Yeah, Chris.
Any other questions?
Do you see when you talk at the end about the tension between Riot owning this world and the kind of negative consequences that has for the ecosystem, for the ecology, do you see a company like Riot's, I guess it kind of sounds like one of those problems that a company has where it's the established market. It's kind of like a Kodak problem where you dominate the scene. You can see the future coming as like digital first. It doesn't mean you necessarily change to it because you're invested in the status quo. So can Riot and companies like them choose to give up power? It might be the greatest big later on, but essentially they're surrendering a
Well, probably not in a way that's going to take away their ultimate monetization, I don't think. If it comes down to, for example, we need independent bodies to be involved in League of Legends to make it an Olympic sport, for example, that's maybe a stipulation to make it an Olympic sport. And then being an Olympic sport gives you enormous, validation, if you like, as a game, if it does happen. Then I think they would listen. But I think probably a bone needs to be thrown their way as well. I think that's probably how it will happen. But ultimately, I mean, the independent bodies, players' unions, casters' unions, these kind of things need to happen just for people that are working in this space at the moment.
I think the question of the autonomy of games design is huge there. I can't see a company like giving up control over their ability to patch the game in certain ways because an independent body he said that it's unfair on the players' careers, trajectories. But I think that's exactly the kind of question you're asking.
Yeah, there's a huge ambiguity that just lies over the head of many esports, but some, like League of Legends in particular.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Josh? We've got to move on.
Great, yeah, cool.
Thank you ever so
Thanks
much.
very much.